I'm Alan Greeley, and I love thinking and meditating on Scripture. Another word for it, which we don't use very often, is pondering. When the mother of Jesus heard the shepherds retell the vision of the angels' celebratory singing, the Scripture says Mary treasured up all these things, pondering them in her heart. That alone is my goal with this podcast. I want us to treasure in our hearts what we hear from God and ponder it. It would be an honor to have you listen in and ponder with me. To God be the glory.
You have been so good to me.
Ponder with me some of the most influential women in Scripture, but more curiously, just to build some excitement for later on in the episode, what does great women of Scripture have to do with parenting? This episode is going to be a little bit different from most. My favorite way to teach, you may have noticed, I like to just focus on 1, 2, or 3 biblical texts. You know, if we do more than one, I like them to tie together and just go a little bit deeper than just kind of surface level, reading of texts. And I realize, these episodes are only like 30 minutes or less. There's only so much depth we can get to. And there's always deeper and deeper studies to be done. Scripture is as deep as you want it to be. I truly believe that. So I don't want to pretend like we're mining the very depths, the very bottom depths of Scripture or anything. But you understand where I'm coming from. Rather than like a surface level view of lots of biblical texts, I would just rather look at 1, 2, or 3, kind of dig in, think about the background, think about the culture, think about what was going on in people's heads and what the problems were in those times, and then obviously think about application to us as well. Well, we're going to do pretty much the opposite in this episode. I'm going to throw a bunch of biblical stories at you, all about powerfully influential women in Scripture, but before the end, we're going to make a point about parenting. So I got this lesson idea from the last episode that I published just a few days ago on Mother's Day. We began in Proverbs 31 in that episode thinking about praising the wives and mothers in our lives and how biblical it is to praise them. We thought about the mother of Jesus, and then we ended up by thinking about why Jesus said what he said to his mom and his close friend at the cross. Woman, behold your son, and then to John, he said about Mary, behold your mother. And there are so many spiritual principles there. We thought about a couple of them about what the death of Jesus does for people who are not physical family. If you get a chance to listen to that episode, please do. I was just so encouraged in putting it together, and I hope you are too. But there's a phrase from Proverbs 31 that we focused on just briefly that caught my attention a little more than some of the others. It's the last phrase in the chapter. Let her works praise her in the gates. Let her works, her deeds, praise her in the gates. And that term gates, I want you to underline for a moment in your mind. The gates in Scripture refer to power and authority, the power and authority of cities and governments and rulers. Scripture speaks of Lot sitting at the gates. Remember when the angels came to Sodom and Gomorrah to see how it was doing and thinking about how, whether God needed to destroy it or not. And Lot was sitting there at the gates. And that's not an incidental detail. That is saying that Lot was a leader within Sodom and Gomorrah. He was an influential guy. Think about the story in Ruth and Boaz meeting with the leaders of the city at the gate of the city to think about redeeming Naomi and Ruth and who was going to do that, who had the right to do that. They met at the gate of the city. Scripture speaks about people standing in the gates of their enemies, as to speak of defeating them. Jesus speaks about the gates of Hades or the gates of death, not overcoming the church. The power and authority of death has nothing on Christ's church. So we could keep on going and going, but you get the point. Gates represent power and authority of cities and governments and rulers. So when Proverbs 31 says, let a woman's works praise her in the gates, it is saying, let her works be known at the top of the top. Let her works be known at the top levels of power and authority of society. That's what it's saying. Jewish society, of course. That's who was writing the scripture. So when you dig into the scripture and you realize how scripture uses the term gates, and you realize Proverbs 31 is saying, hey, this woman ought to be honored and praised for her works, and this ought to be done at the very top levels of society. They ought to be acknowledging these types of women. So men, if you have trouble acknowledging the works and deeds of such amazing women, I just want to say as plainly as I can, you are not a wise man. That is not wisdom. And I would encourage you to do some serious introspection and soul searching to find out, where does that bias come from? Where is the pride coming from that doesn't allow you to praise her like you should? That bias and that pride, it is not coming from biblical wisdom. Here's my point as we begin thinking about influential women of faith. Scripture does this very thing. It praises women of faith in the gates. In these male-dominated societies, Scripture has no problem acknowledging amazing women of faith in action. And I want us to appreciate just how male-dominated these societies were. I'm not even sure we could, fully appreciate it, but I think we could certainly acknowledge it. I realize, we could argue until we were blue in the face about whether it should have been like that, and I don't think it should have, because men and women were created in the image of God, both. So scholars and philosophers do this all the time. They debate about whether it should have been like that and why it got like that in the first place, and how did these societies descend into such male-dominated societies. But just put all of that out of your mind for a moment. Just put the ideals out of your mind for a moment. The fact is, they were extremely male-dominated, and you see this right off the first pages of Scripture. You remember when Abraham visited Egypt, he feels like he has to lie about who Sarai is. She became Sarah. He feels like he has to lie about her because the society that he was walking into was so male-dominated, he thought, they're going to kill me and take my wife. And I realize there are varying degrees of male domination within societies, and the Hebrews were to honor women more than others. I've made this very point about the law of Moses several times on this podcast. They had extra protections, women did, in the law of Moses. So they should have been honoring women much more than other societies around them. But generally speaking, just very generally, across Old and New Testaments, this is the world they lived in. And in that world, Scripture does not have a problem praising her for her works in the gates. Think about Deborah. Here's where I'll just throw out several biblical stories at you. In Deborah, this is probably the most influential woman in all of Scripture. I'm using her first for a reason. She was a prophetess. She was a judge. She was a military strategist, and we could probably keep going. Judges 4:4 says, "Now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time. She used to sit under the palm of Deborah, had a tree named after her, between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the people of Israel came to her for judgment." So think about this. The nation was so convinced that Deborah had special gifts from God that they were visiting her under this tree for decisions and advice and judgment. The text goes on to tell of her military strategist side. She immediately, right after verse 4 ends, she immediately calls Barak, tells him to gather 10,000 men from different tribes, specifically Naphtali and Zebulun. And then she says, I'm going to draw out Sisera, commander of Jabin's army, who was king of Canaan at the time. So she's calling Barak, she's giving him orders, she's drawing out armies, she's drawing out foreign armies, giving advice, she's filled with God's Spirit. Wow, let her works praise her in the gates. Think about Esther. I know we've studied her a bunch recently on this podcast. I'll go quick. She was admittedly a little reluctant to help when Mordecai first approached her, and she may have compromised herself even to get into the position that she was in. Or, As some have suggested, she might have been forced as a slave of Xerxes and forced into the harem of women. I'm not sure exactly. The text really doesn't go into detail on those. But what I do know is this. When push came to shove, she was willing to lay it all out on the line. That I do know. She says, if I perish, I perish. Intervening with the most powerful man on earth, Xerxes, who had just signed a law to kill off her people. Now, granted, he did not know it was the Jews, and granted, he did not know that Esther was a Jew, but he had just signed a law to kill off all the Jews. And she did it anyway. She intervened anyway. Let her works praise her in the gates. Think about Hannah. In the last episode, we thought about Mary and her song, the Magnificat. Her Magnificat song that she sings in Luke chapter 1, or that she quotes in Luke chapter 1 at least, it has a ton of overlap with Hannah's song. If you were to put Hannah's song and the Magnificat side by side and read them, you would see some of those things are almost a quotation right out of Hannah's song. When Hannah was barren, she told the Lord, if you give me a son, I'll give him right back to you. And God said, deal. God blesses her with Samuel, and she ends up singing a song after Samuel is born, and she gives Samuel up to the temple to live. And Mary's song, again, mirrors that Hannah song in many ways. But guess what comes up in Hannah's song? Guess what word comes up for the very first time in all of Scripture? Messiah. The term Messiah comes up the very first time in Scripture in Hannah's song. Here it is. This is the end of chapter 2, verse 10 of 1 Samuel. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the power of his Messiah, of his anointed. Many translations say, but that's the Hebrew word for Messiah. And no doubt that is a prophecy there, because when she talks about giving strength to his king, Israel did not have a king when she sang that song. She is almost certainly inspired by God's Spirit saying that. Let her works praise her in the gates. Think about Mary Magdalene. She went from demon-possessed to one of the closest followers and financial helpers of Jesus. She was at the cross when many had run away. She was at the scene there where Jesus said, behold your son to John, and behold your mother to John. In every account of the resurrection, the Magdala woman was right there. She was in lockstep with everywhere Christ went, it seemed. And no doubt it was because she had been healed of demons and was so grateful for it. Listen to Luke 8, verse 2 and 3. And also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out, and Joanna, the wife of Susa, Herod's household manager, and Susanna, and many others, and now note, who provided for them out of their means. Mary Magdalene, along with Joanna and Susanna, they were so enamored with the fact that they had been healed by Jesus. Mary was the one with the 7 demons, though. And no doubt they were so enamored with the fact that they were saved by Christ, they became financial supporters. They gave money because they were healed. I've never heard this passage, or at least I don't remember it ever. I don't remember this passage ever being used to speak on Sundays about our financial giving on the Lord's Day. But I think it should be. Those of us who have been healed by Christ, this is what it's about. It's being so enamored that we've been healed that we're supporting the cause of Christ financially. Mary Magdalene, formerly demon-possessed, turned disciple, turned financial helper, turned great witness of the greatest event in human history, the resurrected Christ. Let her works praise her in the gates. Think about Miriam. Oh, I love Miriam, a prophetess. There is a Jewish tradition. I understand this is not Scripture. I want to be clear about that. But there is a Jewish tradition that I love to think about, just as my imagination kind of gets a hold of me. And this Jewish tradition says that Moses' parents tried so hard to save Moses because Miriam had received a word from the Lord. The tradition combines some of what we know in Scripture with just imagination. The Scripture says that Moses' parents knew something special was about Moses. The Scripture says in the book of Hebrews that his parents saw him as such a beautiful child. And clearly, there's something different going on there from how all parents see their newborns as like a beautiful baby. There's something different about Moses, they thought. Something beautiful, something special. And they did everything in their power to save Moses from the edict to kill all the baby boys. And the Jewish tradition says the reason why the parents knew something was special about Moses was because of his prophetess sister Miriam. That God used Miriam to communicate to the parents, you must save this boy. It's very possible, but I'll tell you what we know firmly from Scripture. She ends up being a leader amongst the Israelites. Many, many centuries later, when Micah is preaching, this is one of the most forgotten things ever said about Miriam. This is Micah 6, verse 4. For I brought you up from the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of slavery. And now note, I sent you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. God is saying through Micah, I sent Miriam. Miriam played a part in the salvation from Egypt and the leadership that followed in the wilderness. Yes, she made mistakes, but so did Moses, so did Aaron. Let her works praise her in the gates. Rahab. No less than 6 times the Scripture reminds us that Rahab was a prostitute. 4 times in Joshua, once in Hebrews, once in James. Unless I missed some, it's at least 6. And of course, the Scripture is not reminding us of her prostitution to slander her. It is not said as a disparagement in any way. The reason Scripture continually reminds us that she was a prostitute is to say that anyone can change. Anyone can live a life of faith. Your faith is not dictated by your past. Your faith, your past rather, is not holding your faith hostage. If you're being held back by anything, friends, you're being held back by your will, your want to. And I almost forget this little detail also about Rahab, and you might be forgetting it too. She ended up marrying into an Israelite family, and she ends up raising the most amazing, loving, gentle, generous man, Boaz. Boaz was her son. And I think that speaks to her motherhood. Let Rahab's works praise her in the gates. I'll stop there. We have basically done the Hebrews 11 thing, but with some of the most amazing women in Scripture. But since we did the Hebrews 11 thing by kind of talking about the Hall of Fame of faith, for women at least, allow me to steal a phrase from Hebrews 11. Time would fail me. Time would fail me to speak of Sarah and Abigail, Mary of Bethany, and Martha. The woman who was hemorrhaging blood who touched the hem of his garment. Priscilla and Phoebe. Time would fail me. But you get the point. All of these women were acting in societies that were male-dominated, and all of these stories were being written about in a time where society was male-dominated. Scripture is never afraid, and may we never be, of lifting up spiritual character regardless of who it was or what was popular in the day. One last point, and the episode will be yours. At the very beginning of the episode, I mentioned that this lesson would take a bit of a turn and speak about parenting, and here it is. We've been using the phrase from Proverbs 31, let her works praise her in the gates. But do you remember the original context of the beginning of Proverbs 31? Do you remember the original context and why we have Proverbs 31 to begin with? It was a parenting moment to a son. I had forgotten this until recently, but as a parent whose kids are growing up so fast, it's like, your own kids are like growing up faster than other people's kids, it seems. I don't want to forget this anymore. Look at verse 1 if you're following along. Proverbs 31 verse 1 says, "The words of King Lemuel, an oracle that his mother taught him." Proverbs 31, listen to this, is a parenting proverb, and a parenting proverb that was given to a boy. More on that in a moment. But the way we use Proverbs 31 generally is to teach girls. It seems to me that is primarily how Proverbs 31 is used in the church anymore. We use it as a way of older women teaching younger women, or older women teaching young girls, as if to say, hey, this is what godly womanhood looks like, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying that's a bad approach. I'm not saying it's unscriptural. Keep teaching the young women and young girls Proverbs 31. That is fine. What I'm saying is, this is as important for boys to hear. Boys need to hear and see great womanhood. Why? So they know who to choose when thinking about marriage. The mom's voice continues. This is verse 2 now. Listen to the repetition. "What are you doing, my son? What are you doing, son of my womb? What are you doing, son of my vows?" And I want to paint the scene here of what this might have looked like. And you'll understand why in just a moment. Imagine your son comes home at 3 a.m. and he's been fooling around with a girl that he shouldn't be fooling around with. And the mom is sitting on the couch. The son stumbles in, 3 a.m., and the mom says in the dark, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" A third time, "What are you doing? Messing around with a woman like that?" And we know that's the type of thing going on, because look at the next verse. She says, "Do not give your strength to women whose ways destroy kings." Do not give your strength to an ungodly woman. That's what it's saying. And when Scripture says, "do not give your strength," it is speaking in part of giving them your sexual passion and your sexual intimacy. You can look up that phrase, "to give a woman your strength." You can look up that phrase in your personal Bible studies, and you'll see that. At least in part, I'm not saying this is only what it means, but in part, it is talking about giving a woman your sexual passion, your sexual intimacy, your sexual vigor. And if that sounds a little crude, I'm sorry, but I think it only sounds crude because we don't talk about it in such an upfront manner, and I think we should. So you see what's going on in the conversation between this man and his son. I know we're just painting a picture of what the scene might have looked like here, but the son comes in, 3 a.m., mom's sitting on the couch, and she's saying, "What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? You shouldn't be messing around with women like that." And then from verses 3 through 9, she starts talking about alcohol and how alcohol clouds the judgment. And isn't that fitting? Because we all know alcohol and sexual immorality, they're best buddies. They go hand in hand. So the scene is probably something like this. He comes in at 3 a.m., he's got alcohol on his breath, been fooling around with some floozies, and Mommy Lemuel is like, "What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? We need to have a talk." And parents, we need to have a talk. And I'm certainly not talking about you and me or parent to parent. I'm talking about us parents having talks with our boys. And then Mommy Lemuel says, "Son, let me tell you who to look for in a wife," beginning in verse 10. "An excellent wife, who can find?" So friends, you can teach this to girls if you want. No harm, no foul. I mean that. That's fine. But it was originally given by a parent to a son, and even more specifically, to a son possibly going down the wrong path. Wow. I think I could have used some of this Mommy Lemuel when I was a younger man. How I stumbled upon Vera, my amazing wife, I'll never understand. But speaking of that, speaking of my amazing wife, and many of yours I know, let her works praise her in the gates.
There's no wall you won't kick down, line you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you found something to treasure in your hearts and ponder. The song you've heard is Reckless Love, sung by Praise and Harmony on their album, Resurrecting God. May God's face shine on you always.
Oh, God, oh, it